probably about 6 years ago, I got a phone call from a guy with the Florida Baptist Convention who expressed that an interest in us participating and sponsoring a church over at Palm Coast.
Bob Brown, a consultant with the Florida Baptist Convention, told me about Palm Coast. And I began to travel over there and pray about starting a church there. And then I talked to my pastor, Brother Danny Williams, at that time. And our church began to pray about a church at Palm Coast. And all of a sudden, as God usually does, He does something that we can hardly explain.
And while we were over here, discovered that there was not a church that was really targeting the younger generation, and so we felt like there was a real need. Made a contact with a guy named John Shepherd, who became one of the co-pastors at the beginning, who also asked me about the possibility of another guy by the name of Billy White.
Dear God, surround me as I speak.
Our story begins in 1994. A pastor from Palatka, Florida, was driving through the small town of Palm Coast. He knew that there were many people from up north relocating to this city and that there were not enough churches in the area reaching out to these new families. This, he thought, would have to change.
Thousands of homes, thousands of people, and I told my wife, I said, this is a sin. And I went home, told her, I said, we need to do something to start a church here.
At the time, Pastor Danny Williams had no way of knowing that Flagler County, which is home to Palm Coast, would become the fastest growing county in our nation. But God knew it. Pastor Williams and the congregation at PENIEL Baptist Church began praying that God would move hearts and minds to begin a church in Palm Coast. The Florida Baptist Convention agreed with Pastor Williams and quickly moved to help establish a new church that would use a fresh approach to help people connect with Christ. $10,000 in seed money was then donated by Janice Browning, a recent widow who, in her own words, felt compelled to put her money where her heart was. Danny Williams contacted John Shepherd, who in turn contacted Billy White about the possibility of starting a church together in Palm Coast.
Well, little did Danny know that that phone call was really the culmination of my wife and I, and of course Billy and Kim's prayers for 3 years. Because I'd been out of seminary that long and just praying almost every day as I'm serving on staff at this church in Mississippi. God, give me an opportunity to start a church somewhere that will impact lostness forever. So when Danny called, I mean, there was no doubt that this was from God.
And he called me, and he said he'd heard of an opportunity in Palm Coast, Florida, and he said, do you know where that is? I said, never heard of it. He said, it's near Daytona Beach. I said, I know where that is. He said, it's a growing area, fastest growing county in the United States by percentage increase, and they've asked me to consider coming there to start a church. Would you do it with me? And so I told him that I would begin to pray about that.
There was a lady in our church that's been a long-term member of PENIEL Baptist Church. She just got up out of her pew, walked to the pulpit, and handed me this check and said, Brother Danny, I just want to put my money where my heart is. And so I just took the check and put it in my pocket. I'm shaking hands at the front door and I thought, well, how much was that check? And just pulled the check out of my pocket, and to my amazement, it was $10,000. That was a seed money, really, for the beginning of this new work.
When our church voted that Sunday night to sponsor Palm Coast, I had a compulsion that helping to finance that would be a very good use of the insurance money I had just received from my deceased husband. I'm very pleased that that was followed through, and that Palm Coast is a wonderful, soul-winning church and is thriving for our Lord.
So 2 months later in November, it was Thanksgiving weekend, we visited down here for the first time. So we began to pray about it and rode back to Memphis. And we had decided by the time we made the long trip back to Memphis, stopping and staying with some friends along the way, that if God would raise up the money for us to move down here. We didn't even have any money to pay the moving expenses, but if we could move down, we would help be involved in this church if we had to work to support ourselves while we were down here. And we got up there and hit the button on the answering machine, and the first message was from Danny Williams, and he said the Florida Baptist Convention has done something they've never done before, and they've agreed to give you $5,000 to move down here and get set up. And we cried right then. I still remember.
I looked at Billy and I said, well, I guess we're moving to Florida then.
It was 3 weeks later. We loaded up the truck and moved to Beverly.
And we were so scared. We were sitting in Boston Market, and I looked at Billy, just didn't know what to do. We didn't know anybody, had no jobs, and here we were doing something that we didn't know how to do. We had never started a church before. And I said, oh, Billy. And he said, I'm scared. And I said, so am I.
So I remember saying we both might as well admit it, we're scared to death.
John, a rocket scientist, and Billy, a saddle maker, had both given their lives to Christ many years before, but neither had ever pastored a church, let alone started one.
Rain, rain on my face. Hasn't stopped raining for days.
We were encouraged by our friends and our family to take that leap of faith and start the church, start Palm Coast Community Church.
Billy and John faithfully followed their hearts to begin their mission in Palm Coast.
And my philosophy was, we'll go down there. If I have to work, if this doesn't work out and we just have to start working, that's what I'll have to do. But I want to try that. And my wife was fully behind that and said, look, let's go down there, try it, give it our best shot and see if this is what God's wired us for.
After establishing a core group of people devoted to launching Palm Coast Community Church, ads were run promoting the first service, which would be held in one of the local elementary schools.
When asked why they don't attend church, most individuals are concerned with just what may go on there. These misconceptions have caused many to skip a few services, if not forget church altogether. Well, you won't find a three-ring circus. We are interested in you getting more out of the service than a good long nap. We may occasionally enjoy a potluck supper, but it doesn't take precedence over the people who prepared it. We're real people in a real world serving a real God.
Discover the difference at Palm Coast Community Church.
I remember the first day, the first service we were there. We were all there, I guess about 15 members from PENIEL Baptist. We'd gone to Palm Coast to help with the first day. And we were just waiting there, it seemed. We were so tense on wondering whether anybody was going to show up or not. And I think our first service was at 9:30 that morning. About 9:20, no one had shown up yet. And
our service was to start at 9:30, and at 9:15, there were only 50 people there. And those were all of our friends, the core group. We brought our family in. From Georgia to make trips in, so anybody we knew that would stack the crowd a little bit. And that was all that was there. And we went back in a little room off the stage at Wadsworth Elementary School, and I remember praying and getting down literally on our knees, me and John together, and said, God, we are scared to death. We have no idea what's going to happen, but we are committed to you and to see this church get started and reach people in this county and help them connect with you, whatever it takes. And we walked out 15 minutes later, and 155 other people had shown up from who knows where.
And I can still remember that first Sunday morning when we went public. And about 10 minutes before the service was supposed to start, there wasn't anybody here but just our families and the folks that had come over to help us from PENIEL Baptist Church in Palatka, Florida. And I can remember us just saying, God, in the next 10 minutes, if nobody comes, we still feel like you've called us here. So we walk out that door a few minutes before 9:30, and there were 205 people at the first service.
Services were informal. Music was upbeat. Dramas and multimedia presentations were incorporated. Messages were designed for real people in a real world who were desiring to connect with a real God.
It works. Guaranteed. Been existed for thousands of years, but it works today. In my situation, backed up by the big guy, and it works. Might take time, but it works. For all the quirky needs of my family, the Bible, church, has answers that work for my family, my kids, and my son. Yeah, right.
Over the mountains and the sea, your river runs with love for me, and I will.
Soon after, Tony Putnam was brought on board to start CrossPoint, a program geared to reach teenagers in Palm Coast.
When Billy White called Carrie and I in 1997 and asked us to consider moving to Palm Coast, Florida to start a student ministry, it started us on a journey of faith, us being my wife Carrie and I. And it really forced us to trust God in a way that we hadn't in a while. At the time, Palm Coast Community Church had zero money in the budget to support us, and we were leaving a position in Alabama, and the people in Palm Coast said, well, how much do you get paid? And we told them, they said, well, we'll be glad to match that as long as the money comes in. And you know what? We have never missed a paycheck. God has always met our needs. He's always provided.
There's this all-powerful higher intelligence being created the galaxies and universes, vortexes, and nuclear fission. He, she, it knows it all, every move, every moment by everything. And he's actually interested in a peon human like me. Come on.
Discoveryland, the children's ministry, also continued to thrive under the guidance of Mary Benvenuto.
We want Discoveryland to be the very best hour of every kid's week.
As our church grew, so did the number of small groups, and Trent Shockey, a pastor to oversee that ministry, joined our family.
When someone steps into one of our small groups, we want 4 things for them. First thing is we want them prayed for. Second is we want them prayed with. Third is we want them loved. And the fourth is we want them discipled.
That I don't feel any pressure being there. It's laid back, and it reaches to me personally, like at my level. It's not as deep as some other churches. That's what I always told Mary, that.
At a level that you can relate to.
That I can relate to, a level that I can understand. Being a new Christian at the time, it was something that I definitely could relate to.
I can find purpose, hope, a sense of family, enlightenment, encouragement, practical application for my life. A cup of coffee, occasional softball game, find it all and more at church. Church.
An additional worship service was incorporated on Sunday morning to meet the needs of the growing congregation. As God blessed the church and it continued to thrive, there was an increasing need to have a permanent structure to better fulfill the needs of our fast-growing congregation and community.
The hurricanes came through Florida in 2004, destroyed our office complex, and we didn't have any offices left for our church.
This was the plan, the way it was intended, on purpose. Rather than doing it all by himself, God decided to have people be his representatives on earth. The local church, Christians, his secret agents to help the world and the neighbors. The church right down the street, doing God's stuff. Interesting.
A building became available, which would be perfectly suited to meet all our needs. However, there were many odds against getting into this particular building.
My concern was that we had so many people, the church body, friends of the church, such as Bellevue Baptist, who were making major financial contributions. And at the same time, we had sellers representatives who were not in the United States. They were all across the world. And it would take sometimes 3 weeks at a time before we'd get a turnaround on a document. Meanwhile, in these contracts, time is of the essence. And we could lose all of our down payment if there was a problem and the seller's representatives didn't sign off on it.
Another thing that I think of when I think of obstacles is all the government hoops that we had to jump through. Would the city even approve to rezone this property so that we could meet there. And we walked into city council meetings, and we had other government meetings that we had to go into, knowing that at any moment, any one person could stop the process.
As our church family prayed for guidance and support, more and more obstacles, which at first seemed insurmountable, were defeated. Today, we are celebrating God's blessings because in June, we made that building our new church home.
One of the really exciting things about us moving into this building was just seeing the number of people who volunteered their time and put such physical effort into it.
We at Palm Coast Community Church would like to thank you for your support, prayers, and financial contributions. We'd like to thank you for taking your leap of faith.
Praise you in the morning, praise you in the